My billionaire husband was ashamed of my plus-size body and kept me hidden from the world until he lost me forever. But what he did not know was that I held the original vision, the legal records, and the quiet power to become the true owner of everything he believed was only his. Your wife cannot be seen tonight. The words reached Zora Whitmore just as the service elevator opened toward the brightest room in Chicago. Beyond the narrow doorway, crystal chandeliers poured gold across the Crown Meridian lobby, champagne glasses chimed, and hundreds of guests applauded beneath a banner promising that everyone deserved to belong. Zora stood motionless in a deep sapphire gown, one hand resting on the small, beaded clutch Callum had given her for their 10th anniversary. She had chosen the dress because he once said blue made her skin glow. Tonight, he had chosen to make sure no one saw it. The young communications assistant blocking her path looked barely old enough to hide her discomfort. Her tablet displayed Zora's photograph beside a red instruction from Callum's executive office. Private arrival only. No press access. I am sorry, Mrs. Whitmore, she whispered. Mr. Whitmore asked that you remain in the staff lounge until the cameras are gone. Zora heard every word, yet her eyes stayed fixed on the ballroom. 12 years earlier, when Callum owned one failing hotel and more debt than confidence, she had stood beside him in a dusty lobby and described what luxury should feel like. Not marble, not money, belonging. She had designed the welcome ritual, rewritten the service standards, selected the signature gardenia scent drifting through the room, and taught frightened employees to greet guests as though they had been expected all their lives. Now her ideas filled every corner while she waited beside carts of folded linens. On stage, Callum looked flawless in a black tuxedo. Tall, polished, white, and certain, he wore success as naturally as the silver watch at his wrist. Beside him stood Celeste Harrow, his elegant communications director, slim in a champagne-colored gown, smiling for cameras that had never been permitted to photograph Zora. Callum lifted his glass. At Whitmore Crown, no one should ever feel invisible. The applause struck Zora like rain against glass. Her fingers tightened around the clutch, but her face remained still. She would not give the assistant her tears. She would not let the staff lounge become another room where her pain was stored out of sight. A reporter near the stage raised her hand and asked about the unnamed woman rumored to have shaped the company's earliest hotels. For one suspended second, Callum's gaze moved beyond the lights and landed on the service doorway. He saw Zora. She knew he did. His smile faltered, then returned, smooth and practiced. There was never anyone else, he said. The room applauded again. Zora slowly lowered her eyes to the wedding ring on her hand. For years, Callum had hidden his wife because he feared what the world might think of her. Standing there, listening as he erased her completely, she understood something he did not. He had not merely closed a door in her face. He had finally shown her which side of it she belonged on. The staff lounge had no windows, only cream-colored walls, humming fluorescent lights, and a coffee machine that had clearly survived more grand openings than anyone inside the room. Zora lowered herself into a chair near the corner, smoothing the sapphire fabric across her lap with careful hands. She could still hear distant applause through the ceiling. Every burst of celebration felt strangely familiar, almost like listening to someone else tell her own story without mentioning her name. Around her, hotel employees hurried in and out, balancing trays of champagne, stacks of fresh towels, and last-minute floral arrangements. Most smiled politely when they recognized her, but none stayed long enough to speak. They all knew who she was. They also knew she was never supposed to be there when cameras were present. A young concierge paused beside the coffee station before quietly saying, "Mrs. Whitmore, I just wanted to thank you. The welcome letter you wrote for our guests made my first week here so much easier." He looked embarrassed after speaking, as though kindness itself might violate company policy. Zora answered with a warm smile. "You made it your own. That is what matters." The young man nodded and hurried away before anyone noticed. His gratitude lingered longer than the conversation itself. On the opposite wall hung framed architectural renderings of Crown Meridian from its earliest planning stages. Tourists would have admired the elegant sketches without realizing they carried pieces of Zora's imagination. She remembered spending countless evenings at their dining room table, moving tiny paper furniture across blueprints while Callum paced beside her with financial reports. He had worried about investors. She had worried about people. Guests remember how a place makes them feel. She had told him one rainy October night. Luxury is not expensive furniture. Luxury is being welcomed without having to earn it. Callum had stopped pacing then, looked at her with genuine admiration, and scribbled the sentence into his notebook. Years later, it appeared inside investor presentations, leadership speeches, and magazine interviews beneath his signature. At first, she believed it did not matter whose name appeared below the words. They were building a future together. Marriage, she had believed, meant shared victories. Somewhere along the way, shared victories quietly became individual achievements. The lounge door opened again. Celeste stepped inside, closing the door gently behind her. Up close, she looked less glamorous than she had beneath the ballroom lights. Her smile seemed carefully rehearsed, and fatigue rested beneath perfectly applied makeup. "Mrs. Whitmore," she began softly, "I wanted to say that none of this was personal." Zora lifted her eyes without anger. "Then why does it feel so personal?" Celeste hesitated. Silence stretched between them until she finally admitted, "The board believes public perception influences investor confidence." Zora tilted her head slightly. "And what exactly do they perceive?" Celeste swallowed before answering. "That luxury has expectations." Neither woman said the word they both understood. "Appearance, image, size, respectability." Celeste lowered her gaze first. "Callum believes it is temporary." Zora looked toward the closed door, leading back to the ballroom, where music floated faintly through polished hallways. "Temporary things do not last 12 years, she replied quietly. Celeste had no answer. She simply nodded once before leaving the room. As the door clicked shut, Zora noticed a framed photograph resting on a nearby shelf. It showed the groundbreaking ceremony for Whitmore Crown's very first hotel. She recognized the navy blazer she had worn that day, but she could not find herself in the picture. The image had been cropped so tightly around Callum that no trace of the woman standing beside him remained. She reached out and lightly touched the edge of the frame. The realization settled inside her with surprising calm. Someone had not erased her by accident. Someone had carefully decided that history looked better without her in it. By the time the last guests left Crown Meridian, Chicago shimmered beneath a blanket of city lights, every glass tower reflecting a version of success that looked flawless from a distance. Callum arrived home nearly an hour after midnight, carrying the quiet confidence of another perfect launch. Their penthouse overlooked Lake Michigan, its floor-to-ceiling windows framing thousands of lights that stretched across the dark water like scattered stars. The apartment smelled faintly of cedarwood candles and the jasmine diffuser Zora had chosen years ago because she believed every home should greet its owners before words ever could. She was already sitting in the living room, barefoot, still wearing the sapphire gown. The diamond earrings remained in place, but she had removed her heels and placed them neatly beside the sofa. A cup of untouched chamomile tea rested on the coffee table, now completely cold. Callum loosened his bow tie as though tonight had been nothing more than another exhausting business event. When he saw her waiting, genuine concern softened his face. "You stayed awake for me," he said quietly. Zora looked at him for several seconds before answering. "I wanted to hear what kind of evening you had." He smiled with relief, grateful for a conversation that sounded normal. "It went well. Investors loved the property. The press coverage should be excellent." The board was thrilled. He crossed the room, sat beside her, and reached for her hand with familiar tenderness. In private, he had always been gentle. He brushed his thumb across her knuckles exactly as he had done since their first apartment together, when neither of them owned anything worth protecting except each other. "I know tonight was difficult," he said softly. "I was trying to protect you." Zora lowered her eyes to their joined hands. Once, that touch had been enough to quiet every fear she carried. Tonight, it only reminded her that kindness behind closed doors could not erase humiliation beneath bright lights. "Protect me from what?" she asked. Callum hesitated before answering. "People can be cruel. Social media can be even worse. I did not want strangers judging you." Her expression remained calm, almost impossibly calm. "No, Callum." She slowly withdrew her hand. "You were protecting yourself from standing beside me." Silence settled over the room so completely that the ticking clock near the fireplace suddenly sounded louder than traffic 30 floors below. Callum leaned forward, searching her face. "That is not fair." She met his eyes without raising her voice. Is it not? 12 years, Callum. 12 years of entering through service elevators, private entrances, kitchen hallways, and back doors. 12 years of hearing employees thank me while executives pretend they have never met me. 12 years of watching my ideas become your speeches. He opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. There was no immediate explanation waiting for him this time. Zora continued with the same steady tone. Do you know what hurt the most tonight? He shook his head almost imperceptibly. It was not that assistant stopping me. She was only following orders. It was hearing you tell the world there was never anyone else. Callum closed his eyes for a brief moment. I did not mean it that way. Then how did you mean it? She asked. Again, he had no answer. Outside, a light rain began falling against the windows, blurring the skyline into soft streaks of silver. Zora stood and walked toward the glass, her reflection appearing beside the city she had helped him conquer. Without turning around, she spoke one final sentence, quiet enough that it almost disappeared into the rain. Some people leave a marriage because love ends. I am beginning to wonder if mine ended the day you decided the world should never know I was standing beside you. Sleep came only in fragments that night. Long after Callum disappeared into his home office, Zora remained standing beside the rain-speckled windows, watching dawn slowly soften the dark outline of Chicago's skyline. The city had witnessed every chapter of their marriage, from impossible dreams to impossible silences. As the first light touched the glass towers, another memory surfaced with remarkable clarity, one she had not revisited in years. 12 years earlier, Callum had not owned tailored tuxedos or luxury penthouses. He owned a second-hand pickup truck, a notebook filled with impossible ideas, and a determination so fierce it made strangers believe in him. Zora had fallen in love with that version of him because he listened. He listened when she spoke about creating spaces where every guest felt seen. He listened when she explained that kindness could become a company's greatest competitive advantage. More importantly, he looked at her as though she belonged beside him. On the afternoon he proposed, he had taken her to the unfinished rooftop of the first hotel they hoped to renovate. Wind swept across the empty concrete, while downtown Chicago stretched behind them. There were no photographers, no investors, no executives, only 2 folding chairs and paper cups filled with takeout coffee. He slipped a modest engagement ring onto her finger and whispered, "One day, every success I have will have your fingerprints on it." She believed him without hesitation. The early years were exhausting but beautiful. They worked side by side from sunrise until well after midnight. Zora answered reservation calls, interviewed housekeepers, selected furniture, negotiated with local artists, and personally welcomed the first guests who walked through their doors. She could still remember carrying boxes of towels up 3 flights of stairs because the freight elevator had broken. Again, at the end of those impossible days, Callum would wrap his arms around her in empty hallways and laugh about how they would someday tell this story to their grandchildren. Success arrived slowly, then all at once. Their first hotel received glowing reviews. Investors noticed. New properties followed. Business magazines began calling Callum one of the country's brightest hospitality entrepreneurs. During those early interviews, reporters often asked whether anyone had helped build the company. Without hesitation, he always answered, "My wife is the heart of this business." The first photograph that accompanied those articles showed them standing together in front of the original hotel entrance. Zora wore an ivory blazer and smiled with complete confidence, unaware that history could be edited one photograph at a time. Everything began changing after a prestigious branding agency signed with Whitmore Crown. Their consultants spoke constantly about market positioning, luxury perception, aspirational identity, and visual messaging. At first, the recommendations seemed harmless. New logos, updated interiors, modern advertising. Then came suggestions about leadership appearances. During one photo session, the photographer smiled politely before saying, "Let us get a few shots of Mr. Whitmore by himself first." Callum nodded without thinking. Zora stepped aside, expecting to join him moments later. Those solo photographs became the company's official media package. Future interviews requested only Callum. Award ceremonies mailed a single invitation. Somewhere between expanding hotels and expanding expectations, people stopped asking whether he had built the company alone. They simply assumed he had. What hurt most was not the assumption. It was that Callum gradually stopped correcting anyone. Each silence became easier than the one before it until silence itself became part of the brand. Standing in the quiet living room as morning sunlight filled every corner, Zora finally understood that the woman erased from those photographs had not disappeared overnight. She had been cropped away one careful decision at a time, each compromise so small it barely seemed worth arguing about until the empty space where she once stood had become permanent. The following evening arrived with the quiet elegance that had once made anniversaries feel sacred. The penthouse dining room glowed beneath soft pendant lights, fresh white roses rested at the center of the table, and a private chef had prepared every dish Callum knew Zora loved. He had canceled 2 board meetings to be home early, convinced that enough thoughtful gestures could smooth over the growing distance between them. When Zora entered the room wearing a simple cream-colored sweater instead of an evening dress, he smiled with visible relief. "I thought we could have dinner together," he said warmly. "No phones, no business, just us." She returned a polite smile and took her seat across from him. The meal began with easy conversation about the changing weather, a new bakery that had opened near the lake, and a documentary they had both planned to watch but never found time for. Anyone watching from outside would have seen a successful couple sharing a peaceful evening. Yet beneath every quiet sentence rested the memory of the ballroom, the service entrance, and the words that refused to leave her mind. Halfway through dinner, Callum excused himself to answer what he called a quick call from London. He stepped into the study, leaving his phone resting on the dining table beside his untouched wine glass. Zora had never searched through his messages. Trust had always come naturally to her, even after disappointment began replacing certainty. She had no intention of looking now. Then the screen illuminated with a new notification. It was not a private conversation or hidden photograph. It was tomorrow's executive agenda displayed in plain view. Her eyes caught the first line before she could look away. Global Luxury Leadership Gala. Featured hosts, Callum Whitmore and Celeste Harrow. Curious despite herself, she glanced at the rest of the document. Beneath the event schedule appeared a section labeled Public Appearance Coordination. Her heartbeat slowed instead of racing. She read each sentence carefully. Mrs. Whitmore will not attend. Media inquiries regarding family should be redirected. Maintain focus on executive leadership image. Ensure discreet transportation if she arrives independently. At the bottom was a short approval note. Approved. C. Whitmore. There were no insults, no cruel language, no angry words. The document was professional, polished, and devastating precisely because it treated her absence as another logistical detail, no different from catering schedules or security assignments. Callum returned moments later carrying the relaxed expression of someone expecting the evening to improve. He immediately noticed the phone resting exactly where he had left it and the quiet change in Zora's eyes. She did not accuse him. She simply turned the screen toward him. He looked down, and the color slowly drained from his face. "Zora," he began, "I can explain." She gently shook her head before he finished. "Do not explain the document," she said softly. "Explain why you signed it." He searched for words that refused to come. Finally, he whispered, "The board believes consistency matters." She nodded once. "And after all these years, you believe them more than you believe your wife." The silence that followed seemed larger than the apartment itself. Outside, the city continued moving exactly as it always had. Inside, something invisible reached its breaking point. Zora carefully folded her napkin into a perfect square and placed it beside her untouched dessert plate. Then she stood, thanked the chef waiting quietly in the kitchen for the beautiful meal, and walked toward the hallway without raising her voice. Before disappearing into the bedroom, she paused only long enough to say one sentence that Callum would remember for the rest of his life. "Tomorrow, I am calling Maris Bellamy, and for the first time in 12 years, I am going to find out exactly how much of your empire was built with my hands." The next morning arrived with clear autumn sunlight pouring across the floor of Maris Bellamy's law office, a quiet corner suite overlooking the Chicago River where polished walnut shelves held decades of legal victories instead of expensive decorations. Zora stepped inside carrying a single leather portfolio that had remained untouched in her closet for years. Maris looked up from her desk, immediately recognizing the expression on her oldest friend's face. It was not heartbreak. It was clarity. Without asking unnecessary questions, Maris embraced her gently before motioning toward the conference table. Fresh coffee filled the room with a warm aroma, but neither woman reached for a cup. Zora carefully opened the worn portfolio. Inside were yellowing notebooks, early business plans, handwritten service manuals, hotel sketches, vendor contracts, and photographs from the company's earliest days. Every page carried memories that had once felt like love stories disguised as business documents. Maris adjusted her glasses and slowly began reading. Minutes stretched into nearly 2 hours as stacks of paper grew across the polished table. Occasionally, she stopped to ask simple questions. Who wrote this guest experience handbook? I did. Who negotiated this furniture supplier? I did. Who created the employee training program? I did. Who introduced the investor from Milwaukee that financed the second property? Zora looked toward the window before quietly answering. I did. Maris leaned back in her chair and folded her hands together. Zora, do you realize what I am looking at? Zora offered a tired smile. A lifetime. Maris slowly shook her head. No, I am looking at the intellectual foundation of an entire hospitality company. The words settled over the room with unexpected weight. For years, Zora had described herself simply as Callum's wife because that identity seemed large enough to hold every sacrifice she had made. Hearing someone describe her work independently felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. Maris reached for another folder containing financial records from the company's earliest months. One document immediately caught her attention. It showed the sale of Zora's mother's condominium nearly 12 years earlier. The proceeds had been wired directly into Whitmore Hospitality's first operating account less than 48 hours later. Maris slid the paper across the table. This was your inheritance. Zora nodded slowly. My mother always believed money should build opportunities, not collect dust. Did Callum ever repay this investment? No. Did you receive founder shares reflecting your contribution? No. Did anyone advise you to protect your ownership? Zora smiled with quiet sadness. I was not thinking like an investor. I was thinking like a wife. Silence filled the room once again. Outside, boats drifted peacefully along the river while office workers hurried through another ordinary weekday. Inside, an extraordinary truth continued unfolding page by page. Maris organized the evidence into neat piles before speaking carefully. Legally, we need to examine every agreement, every signature, every transfer of intellectual property. But before any lawsuit, before any negotiation, I need to ask you something more important. She waited until Zora met her eyes. What do you actually want? Zora looked down at the papers that documented 12 years of invisible labor. Every idea, every sleepless night, every dream they had once shared rested beneath her fingertips. She could demand compensation. She could seek public recognition. She could begin the kind of legal battle newspapers would eagerly cover for months. Instead, after a long, thoughtful silence, she closed the portfolio with gentle hands. I do not want half of what Callum built, she said quietly. I want to discover what I can build when no one is asking me to disappear. Maris's expression softened into something that looked remarkably like pride. She gathered the folders together, tied them with a simple blue ribbon, and placed them back into the portfolio. Then let us begin there, she said. Because for the first time since I have known you, this story is finally going to belong to Zora Ellison before it belongs to anyone else's last name. The annual Global Luxury Leadership Gala arrived wrapped in the polished elegance that had become second nature to Whitmore Crown. Television cameras lined the entrance, photographers called out names, and luxury sedans rolled across the red carpet one after another beneath brilliant white lights. Inside the penthouse, Callum adjusted the cuff of his tuxedo while checking messages from investors who were already gathering downtown. He glanced toward the bedroom door, half expecting Zora to appear and quietly wish him good luck, as she always had. Instead, the apartment remained unusually still. He convinced himself she simply needed more time after everything that had happened. He left without knocking on her door, telling himself they would talk when he returned. Across the city, headlines celebrated the gala as another milestone for Whitmore Crown. Live interviews praised Callum's leadership, while Celeste stood confidently beside him answering questions about the company's future. Every flash of a camera reinforced the image they had spent years constructing. Back at the penthouse, silence settled over every room. Zora walked slowly through the home that had once represented every dream she and Callum had built together. She did not rush. She did not cry. Sunlight drifted through the windows, illuminating framed photographs, travel souvenirs, carefully chosen books, and furniture she had personally selected because she believed comfort mattered more than appearances. She opened the closet and removed a medium-sized leather suitcase that had belonged to her mother. Into it she packed only what felt truly hers. A few favorite sweaters, family photographs, the notebooks containing her original hospitality concepts. The blue ribbon portfolio Maris had returned to her the day before. A silver bracelet her mother had worn every Sunday. She left behind designer handbags, expensive jewelry, and every gift that had been purchased to celebrate a success built upon shared sacrifice. In the bedroom, she carefully removed her wedding ring and held it in her palm longer than she expected. It had once symbolized partnership. Now it reminded her how easily love could become invisible when one person stopped protecting it. She placed the ring inside a small velvet box and carried it into Callum's study. His desk overlooked the skyline that had inspired so many ambitious plans. On its polished surface, she placed the ring beside an old brass hotel key from the very first Whitmore property. The key had never opened a luxury suite. It belonged to room 101, the modest room, where she and Callum had slept during construction because they could not afford an apartment and hotel payroll in the same month. Turning the key over, she found the handwritten note she had slipped inside years earlier, hidden beneath the worn leather tag. She pulled out a blank card instead and wrote only one sentence in careful handwriting. A beautiful place means nothing when the person inside it is made to feel ashamed. She set the card beneath the brass key and quietly closed the study door. Before leaving, she walked through each room one final time. Her fingertips brushed the edge of the dining table where they had celebrated contracts, birthdays, and ordinary Tuesday dinners. She paused beside the jasmine diffuser whose fragrance had become the unofficial scent of their home. Then she switched it off. When the front door closed behind her, there was no dramatic farewell, no raised voices, and no audience waiting outside. Only the soft click of the lock echoed through the hallway. Downstairs, a waiting car carried her toward Union Station. As Chicago's skyline slowly disappeared through the rear window, Zora rested one hand upon the leather portfolio on her lap and watched the city grow smaller with every passing mile. Hours later, while applause echoed through the gala ballroom celebrating another Whitmore triumph, Callum finally returned home long after midnight. The penthouse looked exactly as he had left it. Every light was off. Every room was immaculate. But when he noticed the velvet ring box, the brass hotel key, and the single handwritten sentence resting on his desk, an unfamiliar silence settled over him. For the first time in 12 years, the home they had built together no longer felt like home. Savannah welcomed Zora with the kind of quiet grace that never demanded attention to prove its beauty. The morning air carried the scent of salt from the nearby river. Old oak trees stretched across historic streets draped in Spanish moss, and brick sidewalks invited people to slow their steps instead of chasing the next meeting. After years of living inside glass towers where every minute belonged to someone else's schedule, the city felt like a deep breath she had forgotten she could take. She rented a modest apartment overlooking a small neighborhood square where children chased pigeons after school and elderly couples gathered each afternoon with paper cups of coffee. No one recognized her. No one whispered her husband's name. No one cared about board meetings or magazine covers. For the first time in more than a decade, she introduced herself simply as Zora Ellison. The name sounded unfamiliar during the first week, then strangely comforting by the second. One afternoon, while walking through the historic district, she noticed an aging mansion surrounded by temporary fencing and faded renovation permits. The once grand building stood quietly beneath towering oak branches, its weathered columns still proud despite years of neglect. A weather-beaten sign announced that the property had failed 3 previous redevelopment attempts. Curious, Zora asked a local realtor about its history. She learned the mansion had once welcomed traveling black musicians, teachers, and business owners during an era when many luxury hotels refused to receive them. The building had offered something priceless long before anyone called it hospitality. It had offered dignity. Zora stood silently before its worn front steps, imagining generations of weary travelers finding warmth inside walls built by people who understood exclusion. Something inside her recognized that feeling immediately. She requested a tour the very next morning. Dust floated through tall windows as sunlight revealed elegant woodwork hidden beneath years of neglect. The grand staircase creaked gently beneath her footsteps. Cracked plaster covered the ceilings, faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, and empty fireplaces waited patiently for new life. Most investors saw expensive repairs. Zora saw stories waiting to be welcomed home again. She walked slowly from room to room, placing her fingertips against old banisters polished smooth by countless hands over many decades. Every hallway seemed to whisper the same quiet promise. Build a place where no one ever feels invisible again. That evening she called Maris. I found it, she said softly. Found? What? The place I was always trying to build. I was simply building it for someone else's name. Over the following weeks, Zora met architects, preservation experts, local craftspeople, and neighborhood business owners. Instead of asking how to impress wealthy guests, she asked different questions. Which chair remained comfortable after hours of conversation? Which fabrics welcomed every body type instead of only one ideal shape? Which entrance allowed every guest to feel equally important? She insisted there would be no hidden side entrances for certain visitors, no furniture designed to exclude larger bodies, no uniforms forcing employees to hide their natural identity, and no service philosophy built around appearances. Every decision returned to one principle. Luxury should never ask someone to become smaller before they deserve kindness. The project slowly gathered supporters who believed in the vision rather than simply the financial opportunity. Local newspapers began mentioning an ambitious restoration led by an experienced hospitality consultant named Zora Ellison. They praised her thoughtful approach without realizing how many famous hotels had already carried her fingerprints. Each morning she unlocked the heavy front doors herself before workers arrived, smiling as sunlight poured through windows that had remained dark for far too long. Watching the old mansion awaken piece by piece, Zora finally understood something that had taken 12 years to learn. She had not left Chicago because she had lost everything. She had left because she was finally ready to build something that could never ask her to disappear. Nearly 18 months after opening its doors, Ellison House had become the kind of place guests talked about long after they returned home. It was never the largest hotel in Savannah, nor the most expensive, yet reservations were often booked months in advance. Travelers remembered the warm smile waiting at the front desk instead of marble statues. They remembered chairs that felt comfortable no matter their body type, handwritten welcome notes waiting in every room, and employees who introduced themselves with genuine pride rather than rehearsed perfection. Zora walked through the restored halls each morning carrying a small leather notebook instead of a corporate tablet. She greeted housekeepers by name, paused to admire fresh flowers arranged by a local florist, and often sat quietly in the lobby, simply watching strangers relax. Every peaceful conversation reminded her that hospitality had never been about luxury alone. It had always been about belonging. One crisp October afternoon, a silver sedan stopped outside the hotel. A distinguished gentleman stepped onto the front porch wearing a navy blazer and carrying no visible entourage. The front desk manager recognized him immediately. August Vail was one of the country's most respected hospitality investors, a man known for quietly transforming struggling hotel brands into lasting institutions. Instead of announcing himself, he asked for an ordinary guest room and declined every special privilege offered to him. For 2 days he observed everything without revealing his purpose. He watched employees help an elderly couple carry luggage before they even asked. He noticed larger dining chairs placed naturally throughout the restaurant instead of hidden in storage. He saw Zora kneel beside a nervous young employee, patiently encouraging her before her first shift welcoming guests. On the morning of his departure, August requested a private conversation. They sat beneath the shade of an old oak tree overlooking the courtyard where autumn sunlight danced across weathered brick. He placed his coffee cup on the table and smiled warmly. Most hotel owners spend millions trying to manufacture authenticity, he said. You built it before you ever purchased expensive furniture. Zora laughed softly. Furniture has never hugged anyone after a difficult day. August nodded, clearly pleased by her answer. Exactly. He opened a slim folder, and slid it across the table. Inside were financial projections, investment proposals, and expansion opportunities reaching far beyond Savannah. I have been watching your work for nearly a year, he admitted. Not because of your past, because of your results. Zora glanced at the documents without touching them. You know who I was. I know who you are, August corrected gently. There is a difference. His words lingered in the quiet air longer than either of them expected. For years, every important conversation in Zora's life had begun with someone mentioning Callum or Whitmore Crown. August never said either name again. Instead, he asked detailed questions about employee retention, guest loyalty, community partnerships, accessibility, and long-term culture. They spoke for nearly 3 hours, exchanging ideas as equals rather than rescuer and victim. Before leaving, August extended his hand. I would like to invest in your vision, not because it reminds me of someone else's company, but because I believe it should become the future of American hospitality. Weeks later, Ellison House announced a partnership with Vail Capital. The investment allowed Zora to restore 2 additional historic properties while preserving the same philosophy that had guided the first. National travel magazines soon featured Ellison House on their covers beneath a headline that spread rapidly across the hospitality industry. The woman redefining who luxury is for. The accompanying portrait showed Zora standing confidently in a bronze-tailored suit beneath the front entrance of Ellison House, her shoulders relaxed, her smile quiet, and her name printed boldly across the page without anyone else's beside it. Hundreds of miles away in Chicago, Callum absent-mindedly picked up the magazine while waiting for a flight. The moment he saw the cover, time seemed to stop. He recognized the expression in her eyes immediately. It was the same calm confidence she had carried long before the world taught her to stand in the background. Only this time, there was no one left standing in front of her. 3 years passed more quietly than anyone in Chicago expected. Whitmore Crown continued expanding across major cities, but the excitement surrounding each new opening gradually faded. Customer surveys praised the beautiful architecture, yet repeatedly described the experience with the same words. Elegant, efficient, forgettable. Meanwhile, Ellison House quietly opened a second property in Charleston and a third in Nashville, each one restoring historic buildings while earning extraordinary guest loyalty. Business schools began teaching Zora Ellison's hospitality philosophy, and national conferences invited her to speak about leadership that placed human dignity at the center of luxury. On a bright spring morning in New York City, the Global Hospitality Innovation Summit filled the Grand Lexington Convention Center with executives, investors, architects, and journalists from around the country. Callum stepped through the revolving doors carrying a leather briefcase and the weight of another disappointing quarterly report. His company remained profitable, yet something invisible had slipped away. Employee turnover had increased. Repeat guests had quietly declined. Competitors kept asking the same question in interviews. What had Ellison House discovered that traditional luxury brands had overlooked? Callum intended to answer that question before the week ended. According to the conference schedule, the keynote presentation would be delivered by the founder of Ellison House Collective. He had deliberately avoided reading further. A part of him still hoped the company had simply hired an exceptional executive. Another part already knew the truth. The main ballroom shimmered beneath enormous crystal chandeliers, while giant digital screens displayed the conference theme, the future of belonging in hospitality. More than 2,000 attendees settled into their seats as conversations gradually faded into expectant silence. Callum found a place near the center aisle. Around him, executives discussed acquisition rumors surrounding Ellison House Capital, praising the company's remarkable culture and astonishing guest satisfaction scores. One investor leaned toward another and whispered, "Whoever built that organization understands people better than anyone in this industry." Those words stayed with Callum longer than he expected. The stage lights slowly brightened. A conference moderator stepped forward with an unmistakable smile. "Please join me in welcoming this year's Hospitality Visionary Award recipient, founder and chief executive officer of Ellison House Collective, Miss Zora Ellison." The audience rose before she even appeared. A standing ovation filled the ballroom as Zora walked confidently onto the stage wearing an elegant ivory-tailored suit, her natural confidence brighter than the lights surrounding her. She did not rush. She did not wave dramatically. She simply smiled with quiet gratitude before thanking the audience for their generosity. Callum remained standing with everyone else, unable to look anywhere except the woman he had once convinced himself the world should never see. The years had not changed the warmth in her eyes. They had simply removed every trace of hesitation. She belonged on that stage so completely that it became impossible to imagine she had ever stood hidden behind service hallways. Her opening words were simple. Luxury begins the moment a person feels they no longer need permission to belong. The audience immediately began taking notes. As she continued speaking about dignity, thoughtful design, employee respect, and authentic hospitality, Callum recognized sentence after sentence. Not because she had borrowed them from Whitmore Crown, because Whitmore Crown had once borrowed them from her. Every idea that transformed conference halls into moments of inspiration had first been spoken years earlier across their small kitchen table while sharing inexpensive takeout dinners and impossible dreams. Looking around the ballroom, Callum saw seasoned executives listening with complete admiration, young entrepreneurs inspired by every word, and investors nodding in agreement without realizing they were witnessing the woman whose vision had quietly shaped an entire generation of hospitality. For the first time since Zora walked out of their penthouse, Callum understood something that no financial report had ever explained. Whitmore Crown had not lost its competitive advantage when she left. It had lost its soul. When the applause finally settled, dozens of executives formed a line hoping to speak with Zora before the next conference session began. She greeted each person with the same calm attention she had once given nervous hotel guests arriving after long flights. She remembered names, asked thoughtful questions, and listened far more than she spoke. Across the ballroom, Callum remained where he was, watching from a distance as people who had once competed for his attention now waited patiently for hers. He realized something almost painful in its simplicity. They were not gathering around her because she had become famous. They were gathering because she made every conversation feel important. Nearly an hour later, an event coordinator approached Callum with an envelope bearing the Ellison House seal. Inside was an invitation to a private leadership roundtable attended by only a handful of major investors and industry executives. His name appeared on the guest list beside several competitors. At the bottom, one sentence stood out. Attendance requested by Miss Zora Ellison. Curiosity overcame pride. That afternoon, Callum entered an elegant conference room overlooking the Manhattan skyline, where a long walnut table had been prepared for a confidential strategy meeting. August Vale sat quietly near the windows, greeting participants with relaxed confidence. Zora arrived last, carrying only a slim leather folder instead of the thick presentation binders everyone else expected. After welcoming the group, she thanked them for believing that hospitality still had the power to improve people's lives. Then she placed a single document before every attendee. The room became unusually quiet as pages turned. Callum scanned the executive summary, and his pulse immediately quickened. Ellison House Capital had quietly acquired the secured debt attached to 3 aging Whitmore Crown properties scheduled for refinancing later that year. Those hotels represented some of the company's most recognizable locations. If the loans were called immediately, Whitmore Crown would face a financial crisis capable of shaking investor confidence across the entire organization. Callum slowly lifted his eyes toward Zora. She met his gaze without triumph or anger. There was only calm. One board member finally broke the silence. "Miss Ellison, are you proposing a hostile acquisition?" Zora gently shook her head. "No, I am proposing a rescue." She stood and walked toward the windows. Overlooking the city, thousands of employees work inside those hotels. Housekeepers, front desk associates, maintenance teams, restaurant servers. None of them created the decisions that brought Whitmore Crown here. They deserve stability, not another headline. She returned to the table and outlined her proposal with remarkable clarity. Ellison House Capital would refinance the properties, preserve every employee position, invest in renovations focused on guest experience rather than appearances, and stabilize the company's future. In exchange, several conditions would become permanent. Whitmore Crown would publicly acknowledge the true history of its founding philosophy. Leadership policies based upon image rather than ability would be eliminated. A national hospitality scholarship would be created for young professionals from historically overlooked communities. Most significantly, Callum Whitmore would step down as chief executive officer once the transition concluded. No one spoke for several long seconds. The proposal was demanding, yet impossible to dismiss as revenge. Every condition strengthened the company instead of weakening it. Every benefit reached employees before executives. August Vale quietly folded his hands together and smiled almost imperceptibly. He had expected this moment. Callum remained seated, reading the final page again and again. Finally, he looked directly at Zora. "You could destroy everything I built," he said softly. Her expression never changed. "No, Callum," she answered with the same quiet honesty that had always defined her. "I could, but then thousands of innocent people would lose the place they depend on. I spent too many years building hotels to become someone who tears them down." In that moment, surrounded by investors, lawyers, and industry leaders, Callum understood the deepest truth of all. The greatest difference between them had never been ambition. It had always been that Zora refused to become the kind of person who had once broken her heart. The announcement shook the hospitality industry before sunrise the next morning. Every major business network carried the same headline. Whitmore Crown had accepted a strategic restructuring partnership with Ellison House Capital. Financial analysts debated numbers, investors discussed market implications, and journalists searched for hidden motives. None of them understood that the most important story had never been about money. It had always been about truth. By noon, reporters crowded into Whitmore Crown's headquarters in Chicago for what had been described as a leadership transition briefing. Television cameras filled the conference room, while employees stood quietly along the walls, uncertain about what they were about to witness. Callum waited behind the stage curtain, holding a prepared statement written by the company's public relations team. The carefully polished pages spoke of evolving markets, strategic partnerships, and exciting opportunities for future growth. Not one sentence mentioned Zora. Not one sentence admitted what had really happened. He stared at the document for a long moment before folding it in half. Then he folded it again. Finally, he placed it inside his jacket pocket and walked onto the stage empty-handed. The room immediately fell silent. Flashing cameras illuminated his face as he stepped behind the podium. For the first time in many years, he did not look like a man delivering another corporate victory. He looked like someone carrying the weight of an overdue confession. "Good afternoon," he began quietly. "I was given a speech to read today. It is well written. It is professional. It is also incomplete." A ripple of surprise moved through the audience. Several executives exchanged uneasy glances. Callum continued without looking down because there were no notes left to follow. "For years I allowed people to believe that Whitmore Crown was built by one person. That story was never true." Every camera lens turned sharply toward him. "The values that made our hotel successful were not mine alone. The guest philosophy, the employee culture, the belief that every visitor deserves dignity. Those ideas came from Zora Ellison." Her name echoed through the room with astonishing clarity. Some longtime employees lowered their eyes, remembering the woman who had quietly encouraged them during their earliest training sessions. Others looked genuinely shocked, realizing they had never known the full story. Callum drew a slow breath before speaking again. "I convinced myself that protecting our public image required difficult compromises. The truth is much simpler and much harder to admit. I was afraid. I cared too much about appearances and not enough about the woman who stood beside me while this company was still only a dream." His voice remained steady, but every word carried unmistakable regret. "Today I am stepping down as chief executive officer because leadership requires honesty, and I failed to practice it when it mattered most." Across the room, reporters rapidly filled notebooks while television producers signaled their crews to stay live. There would be no carefully managed headlines after this. The truth had already left the podium. Hours later, after the press conference ended and employees slowly returned to their offices, Callum requested one private meeting before leaving the building. Zora agreed to meet him in the quiet courtyard behind headquarters where spring flowers had just begun to bloom. The city sounded distant beyond the stone walls. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Callum reached into his pocket and removed the small velvet ring box he had carried every day since she left. He did not open it. He simply held it gently in both hands. "I do not deserve another chance," he said softly, "but I needed you to know that I finally understand what I destroyed." Zora looked at the familiar box before raising her eyes to his. There was no anger left inside them. Only peace. You understand now because the world finally sees me, she answered with quiet kindness. I needed you to see me when no one else was looking. The gentle breeze carried her words through the courtyard, and for the first time since losing her, Callum realized that some apologies arrive honestly only after they are far too late. 1 year later, the city of Chicago gathered once again beneath crystal chandeliers, polished marble, and warm golden light. But this evening felt entirely different from the one that had quietly broken Zora's heart years before. The former Crown Meridian had reopened after an extraordinary transformation, now operating under the Ellison House collection. The architecture remained elegant, yet every detail reflected a different philosophy. Comfortable seating welcomed every body type without apology. Every entrance carried equal importance. Employees greeted guests with genuine warmth instead of carefully rehearsed perfection. Above the restored front doors, a new bronze plaque caught the afternoon sunlight. It read, "Everyone enters with dignity." Zora stood just inside the entrance wearing a beautifully tailored sapphire evening gown that reflected the same quiet confidence she now carried every day. Her smile was peaceful rather than triumphant. She had not come to celebrate defeating anyone. She had come to celebrate finally becoming herself. Around her, longtime employees from Whitmore Crown embraced former colleagues who had joined the new organization. Many quietly thanked her for protecting their jobs during the transition instead of sacrificing them for revenge. Several younger managers spoke about the scholarship program that had already opened opportunities they once believed impossible. Every conversation reminded Zora why she had chosen restoration over destruction. Across the grand lobby, among invited guests and community leaders, Callum stood quietly near the back of the room, wearing a simple navy suit with no executive title attached to his name. He no longer arrived surrounded by assistants or photographers. He had accepted a teaching position at a hospitality university, mentoring future leaders about ethics, accountability, and the responsibilities that came with influence. His greatest lesson was always the same. Never allow ambition to make you overlook the person standing beside you. He watched as Zora greeted each guest exactly as she had welcomed travelers throughout her entire career, making every person feel seen before speaking about herself. Nothing about her kindness had changed. Only the world had finally learned to notice it. As the evening ceremony began, the master of ceremonies invited Zora to the podium. The applause rose naturally, filling the magnificent lobby with genuine admiration rather than obligation. Looking across the audience, she recognized former employees, local business owners, investors, students, and neighbors from Savannah who had believed in her long before magazine covers and conference stages. She also saw Callum standing quietly among them. Their eyes met for only a moment. He placed one hand over his heart and gave a small respectful nod. She returned the gesture with a gentle smile, not as a promise of another beginning, but as an acknowledgement that forgiveness and reconciliation were not always the same journey. Standing beneath the warm lights, Zora looked toward the entrance where guests continued arriving through the front doors. Years earlier, she had been told to wait behind a service elevator because someone believed she did not belong in the spotlight. Tonight, every guest entered through the same beautiful doorway without distinction. A hotel, she began softly, is never remembered only for its walls. It is remembered for how people feel when they cross the threshold. Every person who enters deserves respect before they ever earn it. The audience rose together in another standing ovation. As music gently filled the lobby once more, Zora stepped away from the podium and walked toward the front entrance. Outside, a light spring breeze carried the scent of fresh flowers through the open doors. Her waiting car pulled quietly to the curb. Before stepping inside, a young reporter hurried forward with one final question. "Miss Ellison, after everything that happened, would you call this your revenge?" Zora paused, looking back at the illuminated building where laughter, hope, and new beginnings now lived beneath her name. Her answer came with the same calm certainty that had guided every step of her journey. "No," she said softly. "Revenge would mean someone else still decides who I am. Peace begins the moment they no longer do." She entered the car as the doors closed gently behind her. Through the glass, Callum remained standing beneath the lights, watching not the woman he had lost, but the remarkable woman he should have honored from the very beginning. And for the first time in many years, both of them walked toward a future that no longer belonged to the past.